Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Carbon Solutions webinar series, where we highlight key work happening within our company and in collaboration with our partners. I'm Veronica Wild, a research scientist at Carbon Solutions, and I'm glad that you've all joined us today. Today's webinar will highlight the Local Air Emissions Tracking Atlas, also known as LOCAETA. LOCAETA estimates changes in air pollutant concentrations and the resulting public health impacts from various interventions, with results displayed in an interactive explorer for clear communication and use. Scenarios may include co-benefits of industrial decarbonization, landfill and closed flares, and establishment of data centers, and other community-level changes. Please note that this session is being recorded. You'll be able to access this presentation and all of our previous webinars on our YouTube channel after the session. While the chat is disabled, we encourage you to use the Q&A feature throughout the presentation to submit questions. We'll leave time at the end to answer them as we can. Thank you again for joining us, and with that, I will turn it over to Amy Jordan.
Thanks, Veronica, and welcome, and thanks for joining this webinar. I'll be presenting today the work of a large team of folks. Our names are all up here, and a few of them are with us to help answer any questions you have if they veer into the technical territory. My name's Amy Jordan. I'm the PI of the project, and we also have with us Yoon-Ha Lee, Kelly Graham, Caleb Geisler, Danny Rodriguez, and they'll be available to answer questions about any of this work as well. So I'm going to be giving some examples of case studies we've done with our LOCAETA project. This has been a DOE-funded effort, and we are interested in sort of showcasing some of the work we've done under the project. First of all, before I get started on the LOCAETA project specifically, I'd like to describe how it fits in with the sort of larger portfolio of Carbon Solutions software and services. Carbon Solutions does work, it's a small business doing work across the kind of entire clean energy space. There's a bunch of work that and expertise of the company, particularly on carbon capture, transport, and storage, but also geothermal, wind, direct air capture, and much, much more. So this slide sort of shows on the right a lot of the major projects at the company. You can see where LOCAETA fits in there, and on the left you can see that the sort of the top 4 projects combine to form a software called SimCCS, which is really about the entire chain of capture, transport, and storage for carbon capture. LOCAETA fits in with all of this as the co-benefits piece. So we started with some scenarios involving carbon capture because of the extensive work and expertise that already existed here on carbon capture and its co-benefits. But we have expanded it to include other forms of decarbonization. I'll be giving you an electrification example as just one example of the different types of things that we're looking at with LOCAETA. So on this in this presentation, I'm not going to spend a ton of time giving a lot of background and methodology because I want to jump right into the results of our example case studies. But you might be asking, you know, why are we doing LOCAETA and what does it do? And I think the green box at the bottom pretty much describes our goal. We are interested in helping to quantify the air quality benefits to various types of interventions. So in the decarbonization space, maybe many of you may be aware that there are these additional benefits that you get in addition to mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. So decarbonization at a facility would be any way that you're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but some of these methods also reduce other co-pollutants like particulate matter, NOx, SO2, VOCs. And so we've found, while sort of exploring this space, that there was no easy way to quantify who is impacted by these co-benefits and by how much. So we're going to be looking at just these sort of topics that are outlined here. I'm going to show you some examples of using LOCAETA for carbon capture, where we see the co-benefits because the carbon capture systems themselves, in order to run efficiently, typically need to reduce other pollutants in the stream, like the ones I mentioned, like particulate matter, electrification, where we also see air quality changes. And then I'm also going to show some examples that we did for landfills and for data centers. That'll be all in the talk today. There are a couple of other, other examples up on the slide, and those are things that in our conversations with potential users of LOCAETA and people who are interested in the methodology, we've heard a lot about other places where they might be interested in the air quality and public health benefits. And so those are some areas where we are looking forward to expanding. All right, so I'm going to be showing you a couple of case studies that are in the column on the left here. So we're going to start with the state of Louisiana, and we're going to be looking at a carbon capture scenario where we include both a case where there are extra emissions from the carbon capture technology itself. So the carbon capture system is reducing some co-pollutants, but also has some volatilization of ammonia and VOCs, which has been estimated as a possible outcome of some of the amine-based carbon capture systems that are out there. I will also include a scenario that does not include these emissions. So it'd be the case of sort of carbon capture without emissions and with emissions as a kind of a best case and a worst case scenario. The next scenario that we're going to look at covers the entire US. That's also a carbon capture scenario. And then it's also going to be compared with an electrification scenario across the US. The reason why we do both of these scenarios is to, if you're a sort of a policymaker, you're looking at climate action plans, that sort of thing, and you'd like to compare different decarbonization approaches, we have the electrification piece and we have the carbon capture piece as two examples. And so we just look at them kind of nationwide across a broad geographic scale. The next thing that we're going to be talking about is the data centers example. So we are looking at hypothetical data center usage and the air quality impacts of that, both with carbon capture and on-site fossil fuel generation, or if it were on the grid. And then lastly, we have a landfill scenario to talk about. We also have a whole other case study that we've been working on, which is in the Denver area. And this is a sort of focused project where we're able to look at local meteorology, high resolution modeling, neighborhood scale impacts. It's something that we're really, really excited about, but it is a whole lot of work and a whole other webinar, I think someday in the future, we can present all that Denver work to you because there's not enough time to cover it in this one webinar. So I'm going to start with the example, the case study we did for carbon capture in Louisiana. This was the first case that we did, and we did a webinar on location actually about a year and a half ago, and we started to kind of preview some of this work. But before I even start talking about the scenario, I want to answer the question, why did we do this scenario? Who is this helping? Who wants to see the data? What is the problem that we're trying to solve? So Louisiana has a lot of heavy industrial activity, well above average for among the states for industrial impacts and air quality impacts from those industrial activities. The well-known Cancer Alley is that stretch from over by Baton Rouge and New Orleans. On this screen, we're seeing a screenshot from our data explorer. So you have the state of Louisiana, you have the satellite PM 2.5 concentrations, and then the gray circles that we can see here are the emissions from the 2020 NEI. The pink circles are our estimated reduction in PM 2.5 from carbon capture on stationary combustion at those facilities. You may notice that some of the gray circles don't have, a full pink circle, or they're different relative sizes, and that has to do with our scenario development and what we're putting carbon capture on. As we continue to sort of expand the work, we can look at putting carbon capture on other streams like process emissions and so on. But for now, we're focused on stationary combustion. So the relative amount of that in the PM emissions at the facilities sort of determines how much we're able to mitigate the PM 2.5 from carbon capture. So this is why we did Louisiana. If you're, for example, if you're a regulator and you're interested in seeing what the co-benefits of carbon capture are, then you can use this tool. You can also, if you're maybe in the commercial decarbonization industry and you want to talk about the co-benefits of your project or be able to bring quantified results to communities, then you can use this. And then if you're a community member, you might also be interested in seeing what the potential co-benefits are of the carbon capture projects that may be happening. There are multiple that are proposed and underway for Louisiana. So I said I wouldn't go too deep into the methodology because I wanted to really bring to you the results of the work that we're doing, but I will just talk a little bit about methodology just for starters. So we begin with our co-benefits code, which is what we're using to estimate the emissions changes from carbon capture on these facilities. And this code uses a lot of EPA databases. So there's the National Emissions Inventory, eGrid for the power facilities, GHGRP. And if you've worked with these data sets, then you probably already know, and you don't need me to tell you just how kind of convoluted they are. So we do a lot of work on this front end to match up the carbon emissions and the other facility emissions, which are spread out across these different databases. The first webinar we gave on LOCAETA went a lot into this kind of co-benefits methodology, and we've written that up into a paper as well. So there's a whole lot of work on the front end right there. We're also making use of the Carbon Solutions Concord database, which looks at capture opportunities, also capture costs. So Concord does a lot of things, but the component that we're using here is the piece that tells us which stationary combustion streams are likely to see carbon capture and what sort of carbon mitigation you're getting, so we can match that with the co-pollutant reductions in particulate matter, NOx, SO2. And then, as I mentioned before, we're doing the two scenarios. So we do the scenario where we have emissions from the carbon capture system based on some 2009 and 2010 estimates of it's I think a pretty conservative estimate of the amount of these emissions you would get from a potential system. But on the other hand, there have also been conversations and literature about carbon capture systems that do not generate these emissions. And so we've run both of those scenarios in order to kind of bound what the outcomes might be for our air quality changes. The next step of the methodology is to run the air dispersion modeling on the emissions changes that we estimated in the first two steps. And our team is using InMap to do that. And you can see here in the background, we can see the state of Louisiana, real small here. And I'll zoom in on the Baton Rouge to New Orleans corridor right there. And in the background, you're seeing the InMap results for changes in PM 2.5 at the surface. Those changes from the air dispersion modeling get passed to the next model, which is the BenMap model for estimating the health benefits. So just to sort of summarize the Louisiana case study, we find that there are significant improvements in health across the state. When we look at the numbers from the health modeling, we see 120 to 250 fewer deaths annually, reduction in asthma exacerbations. And when we add in the emissions, the ammonia and VOC emissions from the carbon capture systems, those numbers are reduced by about 40% across the different health endpoints. We find that these impacts are not evenly distributed across the population. With the health modeling, we can look at how different communities are impacted. In the case of the carbon capture at the Louisiana facilities, we find that the Black population is about 2 to 7 times more disproportionately impacted. In this case, because we're looking at the benefits of reducing emissions at these facilities, this means that they accrue disproportionate co-benefit. But of course, that's because they are already disproportionately impacted, the flip side of that, by the facility emissions in the first place. And then these health impacts can be converted to economic numbers, monetized health impacts. So for carbon capture on stationary combustion in Louisiana, we see about a $2.2 billion monetized health benefit. So then the next scenario that we considered was expanding this to nationwide. So now the pink circles on this plot are showing, again, carbon capture, estimated PM 2.5 reduction at facilities. And we also considered similarly a US-wide electrification scenario. The electrification scenarios, I'm not going to go too deep into the methodology here because it is quite complex. But basically, the gist of what we're trying to do is for industrial facilities, we do a lot of work to categorize the units at those facilities. Maybe they're easy to electrify because we think that they're supplying kind of low temperature heat. They're harder to electrify. There are units that just won't be electrified at all. For example, things like flares or power generating units. There are units where we're able to estimate the energy demand with pretty high confidence, and then ones where the confidence is a lot lower based on the method that we're using to calculate energy use. So we have a lot of different categorization of units. For this particular scenario, I'm going to show you electrifying both easy and hard. So this would be a kind of best case scenario where we electrify everything. We then take for those units that we are electrifying, we zero out their emissions at the facilities, but then we move the energy demand to the grid. And that's the sort of the grid region based on NREL's grid modeling. It's their local region. So if it's a cleaner grid, then it gets pushed to sort of cleaner power sources, or if it's got more coal or other dirtier sources of power, then it goes to those. Since we're doing it across the US, that means, all the facilities in all of these regions are getting pushed to their local grid. And then we run three total grid scenarios. The first is the current grid. Then the second one is a scenario where there's a low adoption of renewable energy. And then the third scenario is it's also a 2050 future scenario that NREL has developed where there's a high adoption of renewable energy. So we'll just call that the low and the high renewable energy case, but you can see the details here. So what I'm showing now on the plot is the increase in PM emissions at the power facilities for this change, this intervention of electrifying these easy and hard to electrify units. And so it's an increase across the board, but though I'm not showing on this same plot the decrease at the facilities. You'll see that on the next slide, because of course what we really care about is the net change, right? So well, maybe the emissions have shifted locally. So in the case of where your neighborhood is located, maybe it's not just the net that you care about, but we will take a look at the net as well. And then we can see that the increases at the power generating facilities are much lower for the 2050 scenario. Even in the low adoption of renewables scenario, it still involves a lot of improvements and a continuing of the trend of improvement through 2050. And then for the high renewables scenario, we really see a much smaller increases to the grid from adding all this extra energy demand to the grid. But as far as the net changes are concerned, so here we can see the first bar on each of these charts is going to be the increase in different pollutants. So we have, again, PM, NOx, SO2, VOCs, and ammonia at the power facilities. And you can see how it's broken down by the different types of facilities. So orange is coal, for example. On the negative bar, the gray bar below, on the negative side of the axis is the emissions reduction at the facilities. That stays the same on each of the three plots. And the three plots are the different grid scenarios. So we have the current grid, and then the pink bar is the net. So on the current grid, all of our emissions changes its net increase in emissions based on the power generation sources and replacing it out. I think this is well in line with what other researchers have tend to find about pollutants in the current grid. For the first future grid scenario, there are still increases. It's actually, some of them see a little bit of a decrease, like VOCs. Some of them show a little bit of an increase. You can still see that there's some of the coal generating capacity still online in that future grid scenario, the orange bar, or the orange part of the bar. And then lastly, for the high renewables scenario in the future, everything is negative. So we are definitely seeing a decrease in emissions, net emissions in total for electrifying these units. All right, so just to summarize the results of this nationwide carbon capture and electrification studies. For the carbon capture piece, we see substantial health co-benefits in reductions in asthma and avoided premature deaths for carbon capture in industrial facilities. When we add in ammonia and VOC emissions, we reduce the total benefits by about 40%. That hasn't changed from the Louisiana scenario. The current grid scenario for full industrial electrification leads to negative air quality and health impacts, and we can quantify those numbers. We do have those numbers. The low renewable energy scenario also results in net negative health impacts, and the high renewable energy scenario results in health benefits. So that's sort of a summary of our carbon capture and electrification kind of comparison studies. These scenarios are not apples to apples the way we did them. For example, we really need a full kind of life cycle assessment of emissions and very careful scenario development. For our carbon capture scenarios, for example, we included carbon capture on power generation facilities. While for, in the electrification scenarios, those might include things like carbon capture on the power facilities, but we didn't sort of tie that all in together. So the scenario development needs to be really carefully done to do a full sort of apples to apples comparison. All right, but for any size or geographic region or sector, we can start to quantify these air quality and public health impacts. The next case study I wanted to talk to you about is our data centers scenario. And I opened by sort of saying, why did we do this scenario? But I feel like it almost doesn't even need an introduction. I think it's very much in the news just about every day that there are many large data centers coming online, and in the move to power these very large data centers, some of them are coming online in sort of behind the meter, as they call it, with on-site power generation. The grid can't necessarily support them right away, even though most data centers that are currently online are using the grid. This behind the meter electricity generation for these hyperscale facilities is expected to rise quite a lot in the coming years because of the demand. and the median data center size is multiplying rapidly. So that is the why we did this scenario, because there are concerns about the air quality impacts, and we wanted to take a look at what happens when you use low carbon energy. So we have a scenario where we do on-site power generation with carbon capture. So both with and without carbon capture, we can compare that. And then we also do the scenario where we, just like in the electrification case, where we push the emissions to the grid for the region that the data centers are located in. And we look at the impacts that way, both again for the current grid and for the future grid. This map is just showing the grid regions in NREL's energy systems modeling. We're going to sort of focus in on this particular region in the southeast. And we're going to imagine a hypothetical data center coming online in the southeast. So the first case we're going to look at is that on-site energy production using methane gas turbines. So we did 3 scenarios for this particular case. And this is a pretty realistic case. We were looking at what types of equipment are being proposed to be used on site. So we're looking at the actual turbines and their actual fuel use and what it would take to power this particular hypothetical facility. So it's also possible to put NOx reducing controls on these turbines. And so we did both without and with NOx controls. The plot on the right here is showing just sort of across the air dispersion modeling, the averages of the species. So the numbers, the actual quantity doesn't really matter, but I just want you to compare the sort of the sizes of the bars for the various constituents. And this is including both the primary and the secondary formation of constituents in the model. So the green here is the case without any controls. And so we have a lot of NOx. When you add the NOx controls, we reduce that significantly. And when you add carbon capture in blue, you reduce the NOx even just a little bit further. But the NOx case, the case where you have NOx controls, also doesn't have a change in primary PM 2.5, but the carbon capture case, we're significantly reducing the primary PM 2.5 for the reasons I mentioned earlier. And with the other carbon capture cases, because for the carbon capture system, you need to reduce those co-pollutants in order for it to run efficiently. So then the total PM 2.5, after that, so secondary PM formation is shown for the 3 different scenarios. So our results for the on-site power generation is that health impacts are much lower when you include carbon capture and NOx controls. We have about a 3 times improvement in these adverse health outcomes, including asthma, premature mortality, when you include these types of controls. That just doing the NOx controls alone don't make as big of a difference because you still have an unchanged primary PM 2.5 emissions amount. Once again, this bullet shows up pretty much in all of our results that the impacts are not equally felt. They are disproportionately felt by different groups. So in this case, in the 65 plus age group, the Black population is approximately 10 times more likely to experience premature mortality than across all groups for the siting of this particular data center. So then the next case that we're considering is the same 300 megawatt data center, but now we're modeling it as being able to come online on the grid if that were possible for it to do so. And so we looked at it under the same 3 scenarios that we did before for electrification, the 2020 grid, the 2050 in a kind of pessimistic with respect to renewable energy case, and a optimistic with respect to renewable energy case. These are actually 2 slightly different scenarios than we used for the electrification, which Caleb can speak to if you have questions about that, but it's still kind of a low and a high renewable energy case. All right, so what we do, as I've sort of described before, is we take, for the electrification scenarios, we spread the demand out across the NREL region. So you can kind of see here when we're looking at Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee. And for this hypothetical data center coming online, the largest increase in PM 2.5 at the power facility is at the Cumberland coal plant here in Tennessee. And then the other power facilities in the region have also sort of proportional to their energy generation an increase in PM 2.5 as well. So this is the current grid scenario again. And what we're seeing in the background is the in-map modeling results for the change in surface PM 2.5 concentrations as a result of this extra power demand on the grid. Once again, when we compare the current grid to future grid scenarios, we see that it gets much better. So it's about 60 times better in terms of these health outcomes. These are asthma-related health outcomes, and we also have premature mortality here, but just switching the y-axis because the differences are large. These are all negative health impacts because we're adding an emissions source, so that's why they're all negative. But we can look at work loss days, asthma exacerbations, and mortality. The bottom line is that we can look at the benefits of powering data centers on a decarbonized grid or using on-site decarbonization like carbon capture. So just wrapping up the whole data center scenario, if we add a 300 megawatt data center in the Southeast region, and we have in orange, we have our numbers from the on-site fossil fuel generation with different types of controls, or on the grid. I think it's pretty interesting to look in particular that the no controls case for on-site power generation in terms of health impacts, what we're seeing on this graph here is really similar to the current grid, but that you can improve it significantly when adding controls on the air emissions, and that also when you get to a highly decarbonized grid, the impact of this data center is significantly improved. The last case study that I have to sort of briefly go through is landfills, and we were looking at some cases in the state of Colorado for this. The reason why we're considering this scenario is that landfills can be large sources of PM 2.5. We see here a facility near Denver on the southeast side of Denver. That's population density shown in the background there. And it is actually the largest PM 2.5 emitter in the sort of Denver metro area. You can kind of see the other facilities are around here, but this particular landfill is large. So we looked at the impacts of that facility just overall, but we're not really talking about decarbonization at landfills like we've been talking about for these other industrial facilities. But we, in our conversations out there in Colorado, we learned that there was a rulemaking that was about to go underway that had to do with enclosed flares. And so they asked us to take a look at some facilities that would be likely candidates for these enclosed flares. Unfortunately, they didn't turn out to be the largest landfill facilities like the one I just showed on the previous slide. So the impacts ended up being very small for the changes with these facilities. But once again, we did multiple scenarios. In this case, we looked at a sort of possible worst case scenario where the flares, which are for methane abatement, also are generating additional emissions. And in conversations with Colorado, we sort of figured out how to do that sort of worst case scenario. And then we also did a case where the enclosed flares are not assumed to generate additional emissions. And in that case, we see reductions in PM and VOCs. So in the case of the largest landfills, it's the landfill itself is one of the sort of the larger impacts on health and health impacts in the air quality space in the area. For the small landfills with enclosed flares, the health changes are small, but we didn't know that until we ran it, and so we were happy to be able to try to see if we could use LOCAETA here to support regulators in their rulemaking efforts with quantified co-benefits results. I mentioned the Denver area case study earlier, and I'm not going to really talk about any of this except just to sort of say that this is the other type of work we can do with LOCAETA, which is to zoom in very, very closely on an area and come to understand the facilities really closely. So here we're seeing sort of Suncor, Cherokee, some of the larger PM producing facilities in the Denver metro area. They're up in Commerce City, kind of on the north side of Denver. And here with our modeling, we're doing high resolution air dispersion modeling, and we're combining that with household level demographics. So in the background here, what I'm showing is the output of some work done by Nathaniel Rosenheim, where we can look at the demographics of households kind of on a neighborhood scale that's not bound to the census tract boundaries. So for where these facilities are actually located in these households and these neighborhoods, we can look much more sensitively at who is being impacted. We did a lot of work with community groups on this Denver work, so we have a lot to talk about. And again, I sort of see that as being a future webinar. To just sort of wrap it all up together, I gave a bunch of case studies without really talking too much about how the process works, except in the first example, I kind of went through the first of these 4 steps in a little bit of detail. But each of these steps is sort of a place where there's a lot of complex work, and each one could be its own webinar as well. Even just on the data collection harmonization side, here again, we're talking about EPA data sets that don't talk well with each other and have to be sort of harmonized and brought together and then maintained if you're you're looking at different time scales. If we're zooming into a local area, we're not necessarily beholden to the national emissions inventory. So if we're looking at the city of Denver, for example, we can pull in other data sources and then start to look at that as well. The scenario development, I hope I gave a sort of sense of just how involved that step of the process is in order to make the scenarios really transparent and fully realized in terms of where we're pushing emissions. So if it's being reduced here, maybe it changes somewhere else. The air dispersion modeling then is a major aspect of getting our results in this workflow. We're also working on other types of models and statistical analysis to help with the understanding of these impacts. Then the air modeling results get pushed to the public health modeling, where we can look at the public health benefits. And lastly, I didn't really give any examples here of the comparative techno-economic analysis. There's actually some carbon solutions work that even predates LOCAETA, some co-benefits analysis that looks a lot more deeply into this comparative techno-economics analysis, where you're looking at the cost of in that case, carbon capture versus the health benefits. And you can kind of start to look at how those line up. So that's also something that it's possible for us to do. Really, the key takeaways here from our case studies is that we can use LOCAETA to look at a lot of different types of things, scenarios like the ones we've presented here, but also I hope I alluded to earlier that we can use it for a lot more as well, that we can look at very different geographic scales from the entire US to zooming in on a city, and that these scenarios can be developed to help with policy decisions or things like climate action plans, especially climate action plans that built in statements about quantifying co-benefits to the different choices that get made in pursuit of decarbonization. So we can help with that. We can also provide decision support around techno-economics. We're really, really passionate also about helping communities with quantified local scale impacts of these different air quality interventions and helping them understand how that applies to them. And we can show this on these interactive data explorers that I haven't really showed as part of this, really, because I wanted to focus on the results. But then we can also do data explorers or story maps alongside other really important air quality and health layers and bring all that relevant information together in one place. I'll just wrap up by saying that, the work that we've done so far, all these case studies, we've been working on a DOE-funded project, but we are hoping to, partner with other organizations and use LOCAETA to help with any other scenarios, provide any insights that might help, your organization. If you'd like to connect with us, here's our team. Again, a bunch of us are here today, and we're happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Amy, for such a good presentation and a thorough overview of LOCAETA and all of the many things we can achieve with it. So if anybody does have any questions,